All right, here we go, class, Unit 4. So this week we're going to continue to talk about Romanticism, or this unit, we're going to continue to talk about Romanticism, and we're going to start looking at some examples of how Romanticism gets baked into the very fabric of science fiction. So, um, the story that we're going to be taking a look at from a textual side this week is The Princess of Mars, which was written by um, Edgar Rice Burroughs. And Edgar Rice Burroughs, some of you may recognize that name, some of you may not, but he wrote Tarzan and became a very famous writer at the turn of the century from the early 1900s in moving forward. So, very, very successful commercial writer. You can argue, whether or not it's literary fiction or commercial fiction. I would say mostly commercial fiction, but long lasting impact and a very good storyteller. So that's where we're headed. I've got some details I want to cover before you jump into the rest of the material for the unit. So first off, we're going to talk a lot about what is pulp fiction. You've got a documentary, like a 45-minute documentary you're going to watch, but pulp fiction started, let's just say, around the 1900s, early 1900s, and it's going to run basically up to the beginning of World War II, 1940. These are rough dates, and exactly what constitutes pulp fiction and what doesn't is a little bit up in the air. But it's basically long form serial publishing. So a comic book, although a comic book is serially published, which I'll get into in a moment, comic books not quite pulp fiction because of the pictures and the graphics. So, but it's moving in that direction. So pulp is a type of paper. Pulp paper is a very cheap paper. And so pulp fiction was very quickly produced stories that were serial published. So if you were to go out and buy one of, let's say, the detective novel Pulp, maybe it might come out once a month. And let's say you picked up one in August, and in August you read the first part of the story. And then when you picked up the September version, you would be able to read the second part of the story. And if you kept getting these, by the time maybe third, fourth, fifth, sixth, eventually you would have basically read an entire novel length story, a very long story. And so that's what I mean by serial publishing. And so for those of you who currently watch episodes today, um, and when I episodes, traditional episodic development was that you had to sit in front of your TV every Thursday night at 8 o'clock and you could watch your episode. Now, we know with the advent of binge watching and streaming, more specifically streaming content, we do still watch episodes, but the entire structure of the episodes has changed quite a lot, which is interesting. So we'll talk more about serial publishing. And the reason that we're going to talk about publishing and modes of delivery for any fiction. So let's just go into this for a brief moment. Mode of delivery. So in this particular case, we have these stories that are serially published in these cheap pulp fiction um, magazines that would come out at different intervals. Because of that, it dictated the types of stories people would read. Now, mode of delivery. Let's look ahead to our contemporary day. So science fiction is going to start really take root in the pulps. And then after the pulps, it's going to move into novels and books, full books, which many of these pulp authors will become the novel writers. Then we're going to move into the movies, and then after the movies, we're going to move to episodic TV. And now we're moving into two new modes of delivery for science fiction. And that is both I'm going to call streaming media. And along with streaming media, we're also going to put video games. And each one of these modes dictates how stories are told. When you have a movie, you have X amount of time and you have specific parameters that people are expecting. When you have a pulp or a novel, you have different parameters that people are expecting. Many novels, sci-fi novels, can exceed, in the case of Dune, 6, 7, 800 pages, to the point where trying to turn it into a movie becomes a daunting, daunting task. But then once you get to maybe streaming media, which has been where there's been a lot of interesting fictional development, um, you have hours and hours and hours and seasons and seasons. And so, in some ways, some of these new streaming episodes that we're seeing are far more like novels than they were like movies. If we take, let's say, Game of Thrones obviously started as novels, but then lent itself quite well to streaming media. But if somebody had tried to come along and make movies, I mean, each of those Game of Thrones books are 800, 900 pages, some of them more. You would never be able to pack that much content into a movie. And so even if you made a movie for each book, it wouldn't have worked right. And so I want you to pay, as we're studying science fiction, I want you to really think about how does the mode of delivery impact the way in which a particular story is told. Another one that we have popping up in here are graphic novels are becoming a pretty big mode of delivery too. So, anyways, getting back to the pulps were primarily, I'm going to put sci-fi over here as kind of secondary because sci-fi was this new genre that people weren't so sure about. But detective stories, adventure stories, romance, westerns were just a few. We in this class, we're going to talk a lot about detective stories, westerns, and a little bit about adventure stories. Sorry, romance stories. They don't seem to have influenced science fiction as much as these other three. So, early 1900s, cheap, quick, serial published on these topics, and then we get sci-fi tacked on. Sci-fi really being the pulps being truly the beginning of mass market science fiction. All right, so Romanticism. I just want to do a quick review here. Everything we're going to be talking about this week, this unit, is going to be revolving around Romanticism, engage in Romanticism. But just quickly, remember, it's from the city to the country. It revolves around intuition. The characters are resourceful. It prides on innocence, rugged individualism, emotion. Remember that Romanticism is the opposite force to the Enlightenment. It took all that science and reason and rationality and it said, yeah, no, let's not go there. Along with all of these things, another highly important thing is nature. Not man made, human engineered, but nature. Nature is super cool. That's why they want to get out of the city, the polluted, dirty cities, and go to the clean, pristine country. All right. So, one thing I want to show, this was a scene when I was watching Independence Day again. This is Jeff Goldblum coming out onto the roof to take a look at the alien ship. But in the background, it was great. It was right after I had put together the Romanticism lecture from Unit 3, and oftentimes, when you teach Romanticism as a literature teacher, humanities teacher, you need to talk about Central Park, um, not Rark, but Park, because Central Park is the prime in the whole park movement in the United States, which would occur in the early 18 to mid 1800s, is all about these romantic ideals. And so it was truly believed at the time, and we still to this day believe it to some extent. If you go into the wilderness or if you go into nature, you will commune with the divine. And you can say, you could say divine slash God, and it will rejuvenate your soul and rejuvenate your body. And so this is precisely why people come to Montana for vacation. They come from large urban areas. They come out to Montana. They breathe the fresh air. They go on some hikes. They bump into the sublime and the beautiful, the dark and the light, the danger. And they walk up to the brink of death at a cliff and they go, ah, I'm alive. And then I've recharged my batteries and I can go back to the city and survive another year until I get my 2 weeks off next year. And so it's based, basically the entire economy, our local economy here is based on this notion, this romantic notion. But during this time period, we also started building city parks. And if you take a look at Central Park, it is truly impressive. The size and the scope of Central Park in downtown Manhattan. If you take this property in Manhattan, this is some of the most valuable, expensive property in the world over the last 200 years. And oddly enough, in the mid 1800s, what did they decide to do with a massive chunk of that land? Establish green space. Why did they do that? That's the question. Why did they establish this green space? Well, because people need to go interact and commune with nature and God, something that is the antithesis of man-made, the Enlightenment. I mean, we look at all of this, and this is, super industrial, super engineered, super human made. And this is almost the exact opposite of that. And so we have romantic tendencies all around us in our history. They are everywhere. So, prime example, when I saw this scene, I chuckled and I said, oh, let's talk about Central Park here. All right. So, what is a space opera? But space opera was an early term that was basically a name for, in the most simplest forms, it's a little bit more complicated, but cowboys in space. We talked about this a little last week with the character Mal from Firefly, and then Han Solo. They're very much cowboys. And in Firefly, the entire thing is absolutely cowboys in space. But why did they put cowboys in space? So this goes back to that Pulp Fiction issue, is that we had readers who were very familiar with Western stories about the American frontier, about settling and cowboys and bar fights and brothels and battles with Indians, and all of those things were wrapped up into this Western myth. And we say myth because some of it was real and true, and some of it was just simply myth. But all terribly fascinating, exceptionally, from a fictional standpoint, it's exceptional. It's amazing. So we have this Western myth, and people would read these Western pulps. So as these authors who are writing Western pulps, they said, hey, okay, we know how to structure a story. We know how to tell a story, a Western story. So why don't we just take that Western and why don't we just put it into space? Huh? What do you guys think about that? And of course, the readers of the time said, oh, yeah, okay, I like that. Cowboys in space, I'm in. So this is how space opera was, basically historically born. And so a couple things to kind of look for is that space ships are associated with freedom and individuality. We have, obviously, much like all other romantic tendencies within literature, civilization is very, very bad. And so anything that represents civilization slash enlightenment, industrialization, not good. But what is good is space. Because what is space? Space, again, equals nature, freedom, and in many, many cases, the sublime. So the next thing is that we have our space cowboys, and the space cowboys always guide themselves using their own intuition. They're not going to sit and study. They're not going to science their way out of it like the Martian. They're just going to be like, well, I think if I fly my spaceship really fast in this direction, then it's probably going to work. And so they use their intuition. There's not a lot of science going on in space opera. Not usually. There's scientific explanations for why things happened or are happening, but they don't really care about delving into the science. This space operas aren't gadget movies, and they're often, most of the time, they don't fall in the category of hard science fiction. They fall far more into the category of soft science fiction. So that's our week, our unit. I keep saying that. That's our unit for last unit for Romanticism.